Jason, his invite was actually my first foray into this world of just connecting with other entrepreneurs and learning from other people and being able to share what I had. And now the wool has been removed from my eyes, and I can see just the incredible value from getting out and connecting with other entrepreneurs. And over the last couple of years, I would say 90% of the credit for any success I've had in business has been due to the people that I've met, and probably 90% of those people are people I've met through Jason.
And what I love about it is that because people are handpicked, and because the dinner in the evening is structured, you're guaranteed to build relationships and rapport with some individuals that might provide you with future opportunity, interaction, or insight of whatever you're trying to achieve.
Everything from beginning to end, the entire experience was well crafted, from the venue selection, the coordination, the food, and most importantly, the people that you interact and engage with is what really makes the event, in my opinion.
I didn't quite know just how intimate it would be until I sat down at my table. The thought and care that goes into selecting who sits at the tables is unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And it's become a little bit of a joke now when I sit down at any one of Jason's events to be like, oh, well, I wonder why he sat me next to you.
What I find interesting about Mastermind Dinners is that it seems as though whomever you sit beside is a perfect coincidence, some kind of alignment of the stars. But what turns out is that there's this intentional master plan behind every single person I have sat beside, totally aligning with my goals. And upon conversation, you realize not only how that person can help you, but more importantly, how you can help them. And there has never been an instance at a dinner like that where I've sat beside someone that I couldn't serve.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Community Made Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Gaynard. So far in this season of the podcast on how to grow, nurture, and amplify your business relationships, I've walked you through my playbook on how to foster deep and genuine relationships with people at conferences and networking events, even if you're an introvert. I shared 3 unique stories which served as examples of how to reach the unreachable and befriend celebrities and billionaires, and shared with you an intimate conversation with the legendary Shep Gordon, one of the most fascinating individuals that I know. In today's episode, it's an exciting one because I'm going to share how to become a catalyst of sorts by hosting mastermind dinners and other unique live experiences. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get into it. In this episode, I'll be highlighting some of the concepts from my book, Mastermind Dinners, Building Lifelong Relationships by Connecting Experts, Influencers, and Linchpins. This book has sold surprisingly well over the years and has an average rating of 4.7 stars out of 5 on Amazon over the last 214 reviews. If you're a member of the Community Made group, you can get access to a free PDF version of the book in the resource section. If you're not a member, lucky for you, that is also free. Simply visit communitymade.com to get access. As a second quick side note, I decided to take some of the concepts shared in this season on how to grow, nurture, and amplify your business relationships and go deeper in a intimate live workshop setting. I love hosting live experiences, and to me, nothing beats face-to-face. Even from a learning perspective, I learn far more in a live setting where I can be very hands-on instead of kind of passively, reading a book or listening even to a podcast. Podcasts are great, but to me, nothing beats a live setting. So with that said, I decided to take a little bit of a leap of faith and put together a workshop. Surprisingly, the workshop sold out in about a day and a half after I posted it on Facebook, and we have guests flying in from New York and Spain and Australia, literally halfway around the world to attend this workshop, and I am beyond grateful and super excited to deliver that first workshop. With that said, because of demand, we decided to announce a second date. So for dates and availability on that, visit superconnectorworkshop.com. That is superconnectorworkshop.com. All right, now let's get into today's episode. Now, earlier in this season, I mentioned that it was Seth Godin who originally inspired me to become a catalyst of sorts because of a live workshop that he actually held in New York City back in 2012, where he shared the following story.
All right, there's a character named Thornton May. Thornton is a great guy, the kind of person who knows more than almost anyone you know and wears a bow tie and pulls it off. And Thornton, for a while, was the business development guy at what was the fastest growing IT consulting firm in the country. This was before the internet. And Thornton understood early on that the entire business was built on 500 people becoming their customers. The CIO of the Fortune 500, that those 500 people would determine whether they were going to win or not. And he realized that those 500 people were disconnected and lonely. That if you're the CIO of Texaco or General Motors, you don't know any other CIOs. You can't talk to your spouse, can't talk to your boss, can't talk to your employees about the challenges that you face. So what Thornton would do was identify a city, find 5 or 6 or 10 CIOs and say, look, I'd love to take you to breakfast with these other CIOs. I'll just be there to pay the check. You guys meet each other and you can talk about what you're up to. And in every city, and I went to one of them, 10 people would show up eagerly because the thought of meeting the other CIOs in their town was too good an opportunity to pass up. And Thornton had enough credibility to earn the privilege of inviting them. And what would happen at each of these breakfasts is about halfway through the breakfast, someone would say to someone else, blah, 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 blah. And then they turn to Thornton and say, do your guys know how to help us with this problem? And Thornton would just write it down in a little notebook and follow up later. And one by one, the CIOs all understood that this posture that Thornton was taking, this posture of unrelentless generosity with no upside for him, was the way the firm was acting. And that led them to retaining the company. And it ended up becoming a huge 9-figure business, largely on the basis of his ability to weave together a network of people who wanted to be connected.
Now, feeling very isolated at the time, I decided to run with this idea and host a dinner with a bunch of fascinating local entrepreneurs. And I had a strong gut feeling that I might try to kind of weasel my way out of the idea. So I booked a private dining space within a day or two of putting it into my calendar. And I chose to go with a private dining space actually in Toronto at the Spoke Club, which is a private club. And one of the reasons for that is I just knew that the sense of intimacy was key to deep connections. And I wanted to steer clear of the general noise of a restaurant. Now, if you're a longtime listener of the podcast, you'll know that leading up to that dinner, I was terrified. I was filled with doubts. I mean, I remember, thinking like, what if they think I wasted their time? They're going to think this is a stupid idea. I mean, the negative self-talk grew stronger and stronger as the dinner drew closer and closer, up until the point where I was sitting at the restaurant 2 hours before the dinner and I almost canceled it. But given the fact that I was so close to showtime, I had to fulfill my promise, in essence, and go through with it. One by one, the guests started to trickle in, and at first, I had everyone sit down and kind of meet at the bar until the entire group arrived. And to my surprise, we actually didn't have any last-minute cancellations, which I was actually expecting. But I took everybody into our private room, and there I sat everybody down, took drink orders, and made everyone around the table introduce themselves. Now, this is something I no longer do, and I'll explain a little later in the episode. But I remember I was so nervous, I was shaking. I was in my head the entire time. But thankfully, once the introductions were done, conversations started to blossom on their own effortlessly. And I definitely said less at the table than any one of my guests, partly because I was so bloody nervous, but partly because the dinner wasn't about me, it was about them. That dinner was ultimately a big success. I mean, it went on for 4.5 hours, and conversation did not skip a beat. And I discovered that something really magical happens when you put brilliant minds and unconventional thinkers together in a room. I mean, we've hosted since then hundreds of dinners all across North America, and we still do them regularly to this day. I mean, most recently, I bought out a restaurant in Toronto to host over 90 entrepreneurs. I mean, some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the city. A guest included a former hostage negotiator, a woman who was named Profit Magazine's top female entrepreneur in Canada for 2 years in a row, an entrepreneur who achieved 8 figures in his first year, a couple who has been working together for over 22 years. I mean, to me, hosting dinners is still the highest yielding network growth activity that I do. And I can tell you from experience that When you become a catalyst and connect amazing people with other amazing people, the benefits are exponential. So in today's episode, I'm going to share some of the key takeaways from my book, Mastermind Dinners, and provide you with some of the behind the scenes, play-by-play as to what went into the planning of one of my most recent dinners. The framework that I'll use to break down how to host the perfect dinner for you is really the oldest teaching tool in the book. Why, who, where, when, and how. So let's start with why. To be fully transparent, when I hosted my first dinner, the why wasn't really apparent to me, except that I was feeling very isolated at the time. But when the evening finally kind of kicked off, I looked around the room and I realized that connecting fascinating people energized me. With that said, I would ideally advise anyone to always start getting clear on your why. What is your desired outcome for hosting an experience? What are you looking to get out of it? Is it to grow your network or deepen existing relationships? Is it to reconnect with old ties, catching up and keeping relationships healthy, introducing people who can benefit from knowing each other, or connecting with people you've been meaning to connect with for quite some time, ultimately killing 8 birds with one stone, I guess you could say? There's no wrong answer, but getting clear on this is a good foundation, I think a crucial foundation, for everything involved with the planning to come. The best way to visualize this is to think of the intimacy of your relationships almost as a funnel. So are you trying to fill the top of the funnel with new relationships, or are you trying to take existing relationships that may be in the center of the funnel and take them from good to great? Again, no wrong answer. It's simply a different strategy. But if my core goal is to aggressively grow my network in a specific city or a specific industry, I will most likely host a larger dinner, right? Anywhere from 8 guests and above. In a dinner of that size, it's almost unwise to expect that you'll really get much of an opportunity to have deep and meaningful conversations with people, because the larger the group, the more energy you'll be investing to ensure that everyone is having a great time, and being a facilitator can be a full-time job. But even if you don't get face-to-face time with each guest, you will have planted a seed in that relationship on some level, and sometimes that's the point. Larger dinners are very top of funnel for me. I do them for 2 very specific reasons. First is that it builds trust and rapport at scale. And as you'll hear me talk about in the How to Build a World-Class Network episode, I'm a firm believer that all problems can be solved with the right peer group. And one of my greatest fears is to lead into a new relationship with an ask without having planted a seed or a micro investment in that said relationship far in advance. Hosting dinners enables me to easily plant seeds in relationships. If you were to look at your relationships almost like a bank account, you never want that first interaction to take you into overdraft, right? You always want to be making micro investments in new relationships. And I always say that, I go wide in my networking, but I go deep in my nurturing. My goal is to have thousands of people who I have enough baseline rapport with that I could easily ask them for an introduction at some point in time, and it wouldn't be overstepping. That's what hosting large dinners enables me to do. The second benefit to hosting large dinners is that it enables you to have micro interactions with every single person in attendance, thus giving you the ability to handpick those that you want to go deeper with in the future. I actually stole this idea from, 8-time New York Times bestselling author Neil Strauss. I think he may be a 9-time New York Times bestseller at this point. I lost count, but Neil gets hit up all the time from people who want to meet or have coffee and those kind of things. So what he decided to do is every week, he would invite people he didn't know that well and wanted to connect with him to dinner. And in that environment, he would have these micro interactions with everyone there, and those that he hit it off with, he would invite back to his house for drinks. Again, this is a beautiful way to meet a lot of people and not close any doors without overextending yourself. It's also important to note that there's a naturally occurring and unintended byproduct of being the host or catalyst who brings a group of people together. Recently, I was listening to my buddy Jordan Harbinger interview evolutionary psychologist David Buss on the topic of mating value and what makes you appealing to the opposite sex.
A woman, friend and colleague of mine said she went to a conference and she found herself very attracted to the organizer of the conference. And the reason, of course, is he had high status. And then she met him 6 months later, and he was just a participant at the conference, and she didn't find him attractive. And she wondered, like, what was she thinking? Status, the esteem in which a guy is held by other people, is extremely important in women's mating psychology. And part of that's determined by the attention structure. It is absolutely context that matters, but the attention structure is basically the high status person tends to be the person to whom the most people pay the most attention.
Now, obviously, I didn't share this with you to help with your dating game. I did it to demonstrate that we think in hierarchical social structures. Now, again, if you host a dinner or a conference or a coffee meetup, that's not your desired outcome. But regardless, inherently, you will increase your value in your social status should you choose to become a catalyst. Another thing that you will also increase is credibility, and that is done through association. I always share that when I started hosting dinners prior to MMT, I had close to zero social status. But being friends or simply being in close proximity of people like Tim Ferriss and Mark Ecko and Dave Asprey and Ryan Holiday, that has increased my social value simply by association. Another great example of this is my friend Shep Gordon, who's the famed artist manager who you heard of in the last episode and actually the episode prior of this season. This was one of his best tactics for launching the careers of up-and-coming stars. He made superstars overnight by simply placing them beside celebrities who had already made it. He turned Anne Murray, who was a mild-mannered Canadian folk singer who's definitely far from being considered cool, into a sensation simply by having her take a photo next to the Hollywood Vampires, which was a drinking club in LA that included John Lennon from the Beatles, Alice Cooper, and Keith Moon from The Who. When that one photo showed up in the press, she was invited to host a midnight special after months of being rejected. Now, as a quick side note regarding Shep and credibility through association, I was once looking to build relationships with restaurateurs in the city of Toronto, so I decided to host a small event around Shep and invite some of the top chefs in the city. And again, those of you who don't know, Shep created the whole celebrity chef movement, launching the careers of chefs like Emeril Lagasse, Wolfgang Puck, Nobu. So building something around him and hosting everyone made his credibility and social status in that industry rub off on me on some small level. Now, if your goal is to deepen existing relationships and move them from good to great, a dinner of 6 is generally the ideal number of guests, because the smaller the group, the more intimacy. The more intimacy, the more likely the group will be willing to go deep and open up. And the more a group opens up, the better the relationships will be ultimately. With that said, the major benefit of a dinner of this size for the host is that it often facilitates itself, as you generally have one unifying conversation. In contrast, when you run into groups of 8 or larger, there's a very good chance that there will be 2 or 3 conversations going on simultaneously. And when you're a guest of a dinner like that, it's hard to be present in a conversation when there are other interesting conversations going on within an earshot away. Also, this could possibly lead to regret. I've been to large dinners where I'm on one side of the table and I'm trying to listen and participate in a conversation that's happening on the other end. So this can leave you discounting the people you're sitting with and feeling like you wished like you were seated somewhere else. All this to say, be clear on the why you're putting on this dinner and ultimately your desired outcomes. Clarity here will help you decide if you want to host a large dinner of 8 or more for scale, or a small dinner of 6 or less for intimacy. And that brings us to the question of who. Naturally, who you want to invite will depend on why you're hosting the dinner in the first place. Is your goal to meet new people? Is it to reinforce existing relationships? Or maybe it's a little bit of both. Carefully curating your guest list is what makes or breaks a dinner, in my opinion. This is when the heavy lifting is done. And when the heavy lifting is done here, the dinner itself is a piece of cake. The key here is that the stronger the unifying commonality amongst your guests, the stronger the bond, and ultimately, the better the dinner. This is known as leveraging the power of uncommon commonality, something I talked about quite a bit in this season thus far. For example, entrepreneurs make up roughly about 3% of the general population, which means if we were walking down the street, we would have to stop 1,000 people on the street at random to meet 30 entrepreneurs. My point is we're extremely rare, and that's a unifying commonality. So if I were to put these 30 people together at a dinner table, they would most likely get along. But if you're the owner of a $100 million company and you're at dinner with a bunch of people who are startups, you're taking a little bit of a chance when it comes to synergy. Yes, they share entrepreneurship in common, but people yearn to surround themselves with like-minded individuals. And there's a big difference in the wants, the needs, the pains of a $100 million company versus a startup. So in an ideal world, even if the people have an uncommon commonality, you don't want them to be necessarily at opposite sides of the spectrum. It can work out fine, but I personally don't want to leave these things to chance. Maybe if I share the following example, it'll help illustrate what I'm trying to hit home. I was invited to an exclusive event a few months back. This event was filled with an eclectic group of folks, to say the least. At one point, I found myself sitting right next to 2015 Time Magazine runner-up and billionaire entrepreneur Travis Kalanick from Uber, and a few seats from that was Eric Schmidt, who's the former CEO of Google, who is also a billionaire. Now, sure, all three of us run companies. That's a unifying commonality. However, we're in vastly different lanes. Travis's daily interactions when at Uber included working with cities and countries. He was rolling out one of the fastest growing companies in history, going from 3 employees to 5,000 employees in 3 years. But because we share little in common on the surface, it's hard for us to have a conversation, let alone build a genuine long-term relationship. So the closer the commonalities that people share, the faster you can foster deep and meaningful relationships. We all need to go through different stages of intimacy when you first meet someone. That's small talk, opinions, hopes and dreams, fears and weaknesses, needs. But when someone is similar to you, you move through those stages really quickly. Whether that be you have a business that's a certain size, or a business in a particular industry, or even outside the notion of business. Maybe you're a parent or an athlete or an artist. Maybe you formerly served in the military. The deeper the uncommon commonality, the deeper the bond. It's worth noting, though, that you don't want to invite two people that are so similar that they are competitors, ultimately. I mean, the goal for you is to have, as a host, is to have 4 to 8 incredible people in a room and create an environment where they feel comfortable to open up and share. If you have 2 people in the same industry who are direct competitors in the same room, I mean, there's a very good chance that conversation won't flow as well as it could have, so be very conscious of this. So now that we have the why, we have the who, now it's the where. Selecting the right venue for your dinner is really important when you're the host. Also, the larger the group, this is an important side note, the larger the group, the more work it will be to find the quote-unquote perfect venue. With that said, there's 4 important factors to consider when selecting a location. First is accessibility. Depending on where the bulk of your guests are located, you don't want to pick a restaurant that's either in the middle of nowhere or deep in the city where they'll have to fight a lot of traffic to get there. It actually makes me think, this was early on when I was working with my assistant. I told her to find me a restaurant in San Diego. And I told her a Mexican restaurant in San Diego. There's hundreds of them. She ultimately found us a Mexican restaurant, and I was driving out to this place, and it was like 25 minutes away, which by the time I discovered this on my way there, it was already too late to make any kind of changes. And it was literally, honestly, like the last exit before the border to Mexico. So yeah, be a lot more conscious and cognizant of location. I really think, about where my guests will be traveling from to attend, and consider things like, public transit or major highways. And is it easy to have access to parking in that area? What is the typical volume of traffic in that area in relation to the day or the time that I'm planning to host this dinner? Your job as a host is to design an incredible experience for your guests from start to finish. So take time to consider how easily accessible a venue is in advance. The second thing that you want to think about is value. Now, I'm always looking at restaurants that have great reviews. 3.5 stars across TripAdvisor, Google, Yelp is a minimum. I also avoid restaurants that are pretentious or overpriced, especially if I'm the one paying, which is something I'll touch on a little more later. The third thing is the dietary restrictions of your dinner guests. So in my circles, this can be a fun one to navigate because I have friends who are paleo, I have some friends who are keto or vegan or halal, you name it. So to err on the side of caution, I tend to use restaurants that have a wide variety of options and are willing to accommodate various restrictions or allergies. With that said, one of the easiest types of cuisines to work with, as mentioned earlier, is Mexican because they can generally accommodate most dietary restrictions on the fly. The fourth thing I look for is intimacy, especially if it's a larger group. When you're at a table of 4 or 6, you can host that almost anywhere. But in a group of 8 or more, you'll most likely need to start looking into private or at least semi-private dining rooms. The problem with booking these rooms is that not only are they hard to come by, but they can be super costly as well. If you're covering the bill, your cost per head may rise significantly because of prefix menus. You can go to a restaurant where an appetizer, an entree, and dessert will cost you roughly $40 per person. However, with those same choices, it's now $70 or more on a prefix menu. Now, I side with the restaurants on one end because they want to limit meal selections in order to streamline service in the kitchen, which totally makes sense. However, it's also a little bit of a money grab. I mean, that's where they make a good portion of their restaurant revenues is private events. What I'll often try to do is negotiate with the restaurant before I make my booking so that my guests can order right off the main menu versus the prefix one. Now, sometimes they won't budge, and if that's the case and the menu permits, my wife Candace, who hosts these dinners with me from time to time, she'll pitch them the idea of ordering just a slew of options for everyone to share. And I love this alternative because it creates this illusion of a feast with a constant stream of food throughout the evening while cutting oftentimes the overall food cost by as much as 30 to 40%. So with food costs in mind, you'll also need to navigate minimums, which can kill you if left unchecked. At a recent dinner I held, their minimum was set roughly to about $110 per person. Doing the basic math, they were accounting for 4 drinks per person plus the prefix menu of $65. And I told them that if my guests are averaging 4 drinks each, I'm going to have some liabilities on my hands. So I generally budget 1 or 2 drinks per person, as you'll have some who drink maybe a little bit more and some who won't drink at all. So always try to keep that in mind that you can and should negotiate on minimums. Another question you need to ask yourself as the host and organizer is when. And in deciding on when, you need to go back and look at the who. Given the type of people you're inviting, is it best to host something during the week or on the weekend? In my view, when you're dealing with busy entrepreneurs or busy professionals who are also parents, weekdays tend to work best. In my world, weekends are reserved for family. However, if you're dealing with young professionals, for example, Fridays or Saturdays might be a better fit. So again, look at the demographics of your guests and think about what timing-wise would work best given their lifestyle and plan accordingly. You may want to steer clear of the after-hour conflict of dinners altogether and opt to host breakfast or a lunch instead. I choose to host dinners because they're not constrained by an end time in a way that a lunch would be. So you can plan a 2-hour dinner, but if conversation goes well, people will most often stay well beyond that, and doing a dinner allows for that flexibility. You rarely have that opportunity if you're doing a breakfast or in a lunch setting. However, the trade-off is that sometimes lunches and breakfasts can be easier to get people to commit to because it doesn't conflict with their evening commitments, right? My buddy Derek Coburn from Cadre DC has hosted hundreds of lunches with great success, and you'll be actually hearing from him in an upcoming episode. So regardless what you choose, the same framework really applies. With that said, one of the best opportunities to host a dinner is in tandem with a conference that you'll be attending, or maybe it's just a conference that's happening in your hometown. If you could do this, there's 3 benefits. First, people who are going to an event share some form of commonality or common interest by default, which again is an important factor to the overall success of a dinner. Second, many events will offer a list of attendees or some sort of access to an online community before the event, so it's easy to create a list of people to reach out to as potential guests. And third, is that you're catching people outside of their natural routine and their day-to-day stimulus, I guess you could say. Many people have dinners with their family, or they do yoga on Wednesday nights, or they have a date night with their spouse on Friday. So hosting a dinner for a bunch of people who are traveling is an easy way to steer clear of the normal day-to-day commitments and responsibilities that may otherwise keep them from attending. Also, BJ Fogg, who has a philosophy that if you drastically change your environment, you drastically change your behavior. So if you happen to catch someone while they're in a new environment, you're more likely to get a yes to requests when no may historically have been their default. With all that said, once you have an idea as to when you want to host your dinner, schedule it. Even though I've hosted hundreds of dinners over the years, I still need to push myself to make that first step and put it in the calendar. Scheduling it makes it real, and your likeliness to follow through with a dinner goes up tenfold once you put it in your calendar right away. Now that you have the why, the when, the where, and the who locked down, the magical question is how. How do you host a dinner? The nitty-gritty details of that, including invite strategies, scripts, can be found in my book, Mastermind Dinners, but I will share with you an example of one of my own recent dinners. Now, the why for this particular dinner was that I realized I had built an incredible network of friends and peers across North America, or even globally, but I wasn't really plugged into what was going on locally in my own city. And given where I am in my life and the fact that my family has started to really establish roots, I guess, in our town, I start to have a strong desire to know my community. Not only do I want to support local business, but I want to know the owners behind the restaurants and the real estate, the people who really shape the city. So my goal was to host a dinner and invite those people. As for the question of when, I had decided to host this dinner on a Wednesday in July 16th to be exact. Now, seasonally, it's not a good nor a bad time of year to do it. It doesn't fall on any major holidays, and it's not necessarily a high off time, I guess you could say, when people would be out of town. But full transparency, I made the decision to host something in like early June, so I followed my advice and put something on the schedule right away so that I couldn't weasel out of it. As for the location, or the where, the venue we selected was a distillery event space, and I chose that because of a couple of reasons. One, it was 20 minutes outside the city, so it was relatively accessible. Two, it had just opened, so it was a place that none of my guests had been to previously, meaning that this would be a fresh new experience for them. And three, it ensured intimacy as we were the only group on property. So the who was local entrepreneurs who were doing interesting things. Their industries varied, but their unifying commonalities were that they had roots locally, were business owners, and were fascinating on some level. So with the why, the when, and the where out of the way, let me break down the how. Here's a behind-the-scenes play-by-play of how it all went down. So first things first, I scheduled it. Again, getting in the calendar makes it real. The second thing was I booked a restaurant. And in this case, I didn't book a restaurant, I booked a property and a catering company, which is above and beyond what I normally do. I try to really design to make these things as easy as possible, because if I make them complex and complicated, oftentimes it just gives me more reason not to follow through with it. But in this case, I really want to create a unique experience because I was hosting some of the biggest players in business in the city. So ended up booking a outside property, I guess you could say. Then I looked through my existing contacts to see who I wanted to invite. There's an adage in sales, I think it's from a movie with one of the Baldwins, which is the ABCs of sales, which is always be closing. Well, for me, I guess the super connector ABCs is always be collecting. Anytime I stumble across someone interesting on a blog, magazine article, newspaper, social media post, I capture their name and tag their location into my CRM. And if you do this enough, over time, you build out a robust list of fascinating people to connect with when you're in their city. The beautiful thing about hosting this particular dinner is that I was starting from scratch. The majority of the dinners that I host now are easy because I have a name and I have a reputation. In this case, however, I knew almost nobody locally, so it forced me to become a beginner again and really kind of look outside the box. So because of this, I had to pull my fringe relationships. I talk more about the importance of building your fringe relationships on the How to Build a World-Class Network episode that's coming up later this season. But really quickly, pulling your fringe relationships is ultimately posting on social media or even sending an email to your email list saying something along the lines of, I'm thinking of hosting a dinner in such and such a city, fill in the blank, put in, it's for entrepreneurs, it's for artists, for moms, whoever. If there's someone who should be on our consideration list or my consideration list, please let me know. Now, I've been building my fringe relationships for a few years, so every time I make a post like this on almost any platform, like Facebook, for example, I inevitably draw 40 to 70 names from that alone. After that, I asked myself, if I'm a notable entrepreneur living in this city, where can I be found? This led me to looking into local business associations. It forced me to deep dive into the business archives of our local newspaper online, regional or national business magazines, and even past local business award recipients, along with any runner-ups. Anything I could find that would help me start to build my first invite list. At this step is when I considered partnering with connectors. One thing that I noticed when researching people for this dinner was that influencers, or more specifically connectors, started to surface. People who seem to show up time and time again. And it looks like they know everyone. These folks can be oftentimes lawyers, publicists, journalists, real estate investors, venture capitalists, even other event producers who host their own community building events can be excellent connectors to partner with. This can be an opportunity to embrace those with already established networks by partnering with them. Now, if a partnership seems too heavy for you, another alternative is to simply offer these connectors the opportunity to invite a few guests of their own. Now, if you choose to go that route, ensure that you're very clear with them the type of person that you're looking for. Now, once I had created an invite list, it was time to prioritize them. Now, you can probably tell by now that I am very methodical when it comes to invites. There are two schools of thought when it comes to sending invitations for something like dinners. The first is to spray and pray, which is essentially sending an email blast out to a bunch of people and see who will sign up. The second is a much more targeted approach. Because I genuinely care about the synergy at the table, I've always chosen the latter. If you subscribe to handpicking your dinner guests as well, there are two real ways to approach prioritizing invitations. First is focusing on anchor tenants, and the second is working up the food chain. Now, looking back, I believe I may have learned the working up the food chain philosophy from Ryan Holiday, his book trailer specifically for his book, Trust Me, I'm Lying. His book is based in media and PR, but the tactic can easily be used in a, dinner invite setting. His methodology to get major PR is to start small. You send your story to a small personal blog from an anonymous email. They get an exclusive, you get an outlet. You then take that link and then send another anonymous email to a larger site. And like links in a chain, you start to move your story to larger and more influential sites until eventually your story becomes the story and you're featured in a major publication. I'll give you an example of working up the food chain, that approach when it comes to dinner invitations. Let's say you have 10 prospects, so you start small. You invite the person who would most likely give you a yes. Oftentimes, this is someone who is in the least amount of demand and maybe has the smallest influence. And once you get that person on board, you move to the second most likely person to give you a yes. And similar to Ryan's approach, you work yourself up the chain, building that social proof along the way. And once you've gotten to the end of that prospect list, you already have 9 in the bag. So you're probably feeling pretty good and confident. And you can now use that social proof when inviting the 10th person. It's important to note that when I say social proof, I don't mean name dropping. Name dropping can backfire in many ways. The only time I will drop someone's name in an invitation is if it's a mutual friend, because I need to anticipate that they will reach out to that said person to confirm that what I'm saying is true. So most of the time, if I decide to use social proof, I actually won't even use names altogether, but I'll use achievements. I'll say, we have a fascinating group of folks in attendance, including someone who raised $125 million, or someone who's a 3-time New York Times bestselling author. Or I'll point to past guests that we've had at dinners. So again, name dropping can be messy, so leverage achievements instead. The second approach to prioritizing invitations is to get the big fish first, also known as the anchor tenant. This philosophy was taken from real estate, where if you have a flailing mall, for example, if you were to get a Nordstrom's, other premium retailers would soon follow. When it comes to this form of outreach, though, there's often a lot more work and strategy involved that goes into it. But as they say in the dating world, sometimes it's easier to pick up a single 10 than it is to pick up 4 8s, because all your energy is focused. Unconsciously, I used both of these strategies to build MMT. Before our first event, I was a complete nobody. I had virtually no influence. I had zero brand. However, the opportunity to do an event with Tim Ferriss fell in my lap, and I knew if I had Tim as an anchor, I could get others to speak, especially those who wanted to be connected to Tim, or people who were already friends with Tim, but they were never at the same place at the same time. So the event, in essence, could be a catalyst to reconnect him with all of his friends. And that idea worked absolutely famously for me. Next, it was time to craft hyper-personalized invitations. Now, you can get ideas on outreach by listening to the Reaching the Unreachable episode, or you can see samples of invites if you pick up a copy of Mastermind Dinners. However, as I may mention at the beginning of this episode, if you're part of the community-made group, if you go into the resource section, you have access to a free PDF version of Mastermind Dinners. If you're not a member, lucky for you, that is also free. Simply go to communitymade.com to get access. But the one thing I will reiterate, though, is the key to a compelling invite is a strong why. Let me frame it that way. And you may have watched celebrated TED speaker Simon Sinek preach that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And although this is true, my friend Simon Bowen respectfully suggests that it may be more accurate to say people don't care about what you do until they know they are the reason why you are doing it. And I wholeheartedly agree with this notion. People don't care about your why unless it involves them. So in my invitations for this dinner, I explained why I was hosting the dinner, which it wasn't about me. It was about connecting the entrepreneurial community in our town because it was fragmented. The restaurateurs only knew other restaurateurs. The people in tech only knew other people in tech. It was an opportunity to cross-pollinate different entrepreneurs who shared one strong thing in common. They lived and operated their businesses in the same city. Me getting connected with the movers and shakers in the community was a byproduct of being a catalyst connecting them all. So that was the compelling why. I then followed up with why I was specifically inviting them. Maybe I read about them in a magazine, or maybe I was a customer of theirs, or maybe just simply a fan of their work. I ensured that not only did I have a compelling why for hosting the dinner, but that the why both involved and benefited them. Another example of this is how I actually structured my very first dinner, the one that I was absolutely terrified to host. I wanted to connect with great entrepreneurs, but I didn't know any. So I got a copy of a local business magazine, and it was basically a publication of all the rankings of the top businesses in the region. And then I reached out to the entrepreneurs on that said list, and I said, I'm hosting a dinner for Profit Magazine alumni, people who are on this top 500 list. Would you like to come? I didn't make the dinner about me. I made it about them. And that's why I was able to fill that first dinner without having any network whatsoever. All those people I reached out to cold. Now, in full transparency, just to kind of manage expectations, when I do dinners now, I did a dinner in New York 2 years ago where I invited 34 people. 33 of them showed up. So my, conversion rate on invitations is 95 to 98%. On that first dinner, it was probably 10% if I was lucky. So if you're starting out from bare bones scratch like I was, I'm giving you a roadmap, but do understand that if you're starting this with absolutely no existing peer group, you're going to have to knock on a lot of doors oftentimes to at least get that momentum started. But the beautiful thing about these dinners is that the first one, that heavy lifting really happens with the first one. They all get significantly easier as you go along. So now having a clear understanding of who I was going to invite, I then trickled out and tracked invitations. We used a Google Doc for this, and I tagged people during different stages of being invited. So I had invited, I had pending, so people who replied but were uncertain if they could make it. I had folks who declined, folks who signed up, etc. For the sample of this spreadsheet and the tags that we use, I'll go ahead and I'll share it in the Community Made group. Again, share a lot of the resources with the Community Made group. If you're not a member, just go to communitymade.com to get access to that. Now, once someone has accepted their invitation, I sent them a calendar invite along with a quick intake form. Now, intake forms are something we've been leveraging for years with Mastermind Talks. However, for our dinners, it's something that we started rather recently. The intake forms really help streamline important information like dietary restrictions and capture details about them that will help with both assigned seating and their introduction to the group. Another really important piece to the intake form is the ability to nominate someone else for the dinner should space become available. I'm a firm believer that amazing people know other amazing people. So incorporating some kind of nomination opportunity or referral can be invaluable in growing your potential invite list for future dinners. Now, with the invites accepted and the intake forms completed, the day before the dinner, I sent out an email reminder to both build anticipation and confirm that no scheduled conflicts have kind of arisen on their end. To help build that anticipation, I leveraged what I talked about a little earlier in this episode, where I shared the achievements of some of the folks in the group, and often those achievements have been captured in that intake form process. What I'm going to do, just off the top of my head, is I'm actually going to include our intake forms for our dinner, so you can use that as an example. That will be found in the resource section of the Community Made group. On the early afternoon of the dinner, I then text everyone individually from my personal cell phone number to, again, ensure that a conflict hasn't kind of arisen on their end, and to make it easy to communicate with me should they be late. Also, it somewhat personalizes things, which is important. Shortly after I send my text out, it's time for that final preparation where I prepare how I'm going to open the dinner, how I'm going to introduce certain people. I create assigned seating charts. Then usually about an hour or so before the dinner starts, I actually arrive at the restaurant to kind of get comfortable, meet the servers, and lay out those assigned seating table cards. I do this actually for all dinners, especially at restaurants. If I show up an hour in advance, I can often pick the table I want to host the dinner at to ensure intimacy, which is always a nice little side bonus. As people strolled in, I focused on greeting as many of them as I could at the entrance. Walking into an unfamiliar environment can make most people anxious, but welcoming them and helping them settle in can make them comfortable and feel safe ultimately. When everybody had arrived, I then sat them down and said my opening remarks. In my opening remarks, I touched on some housekeeping things like approximate dinner duration, menu items, and such. I then set the tone by reconfirming with everyone why I was hosting the dinner, and then proceeded to go around the table and introduce everybody one by one. Now, I started to do this over the years because historically, from the dinners that I've hosted, I've realized that a lot of people suck at introducing themselves. Not too many people have listened to the Clay Bear episode of this season, and they either get nervous and they ramble, or most often they're in our group settings, they're super humble and undersell their achievements. So in that moment, I try to sing their praises and be their biggest fan. I give context as to my relationship with them and why they were invited. So I may say, James was my first ever mentor, or I stumbled across Jim in a Forbes article, or so on and so forth. Now, because the group is curated, there's an unspoken level of safety there. And I confirm that by making mention that there's a strict no soliciting policy in place, and that loose lips sink ships. Everything shared at that dinner does not leave that room. The reason I am so adamant about creating a space where people feel safe is because relationships move at the speed of vulnerability. And in order to create an environment where people feel like they can open up, they first need to feel safe. The second thing you can do to ensure that people feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable is by leading with vulnerability yourself. This is called a vulnerability loop, where if I'm vulnerable, the person I'm speaking to will most likely reciprocate by being vulnerable as well. There are other ways to open up dinners by using conversation icebreakers or table topics or having dinner themes, things that I talk about in my book, Mastermind Dinners. But what I just shared with you is my favorite way to kick off a dinner or a gathering of any kind. So it's dinner time. I am notorious for not eating dinner when hosting a large group. I am often found walking around, ensuring meals are right, drinks are ordered, and conversations are flowing. I hover around a bit like a pit boss at a casino. Oddly enough, one thing I'm watching for, similar to a pit boss, is body language. Is there someone dominating a conversation? Is there someone who looks uncomfortable? Again, the larger the dinner, the more of a facilitator role you will need to play, and being a facilitator can be a full-time job. Now, once the dinner is close to done, generally I do it between entrees and desserts. You have to kind of look for that opening, but I move to the closing of the dinner. Historically, I would just express my gratitude for their presence and participation, but I started to integrate something that has worked out really well, the champagne moment question. This is a question that you've heard me talk about several times in this season because it's so powerful. And that question is, if we were to meet a year from today with a bottle of champagne, what are we celebrating? This is such a great question to ask in a setting like this because it gives everybody in the room an opportunity to get a snapshot of what everybody is working towards, even if they're not seated at the same table. And more often than not, that leads to several follow-up conversations when the dinner is done. At this particular dinner, people ended up organizing around the bar in several groups to talk about how they could help and support each other with their champagne moment answers. If the setting permits, I always try to capture a group photo of everyone. The reason for this is because amazing people become increasingly amazing over time. A quick example of what I mean is in 1911, Ernest Slovey held a conference in Brussels that was considered to be a turning point in modern physics and chemistry because 17 of the 29 people who attended that conference went on to make groundbreaking scientific discoveries and receive the Nobel Prize. As my friend Clay Hebert says, they weren't in the photograph because they won Nobel Prizes. They won Nobel Prizes because they were in the photograph. That photo is now a famous piece of history and is a great reminder that amazing people become increasingly amazing over time. Anyways, getting back to this dinner that I held in July, that night or the following morning, I sent a thank you note. And generally in these thank you notes, I'll make some comments about the dinner. If I'm really on the ball, I'll actually include everybody's champagne moment answer. I'll share the group photo if one was taken. And if I have everyone's permission in advance, I will list the name and the emails of all the folks who were in attendance. My buddy Saul Orwell does a version of this, I guess a leaner, more informal version of this, where he'll just take everybody and put them into a Facebook Messenger group chat, which works great because it's easy for people to friend one another. And yeah, works great for him. But I'll usually try to put quite a bit of effort into that follow-up email when possible. Now, coming off the high of that experience, this is also a great opportunity to ask if they know anyone who should be on your consideration list for the next dinner. Again, never forget that amazing people know other amazing people. Now, based on my micro interactions that I talked about earlier in this episode, I'll choose a handful of people to move further down the relationship, intimacy funnel, to go deeper with in essence. That may involve having them at a more intimate dinners in the future, or even something along the lines of a one-on-one. A quick side bonus for you overachievers out there: if you capture the answers to the champagne moment question shared during the dinner, which I also capture as well in the pre-dinner intake form, and you pay close attention to when people achieve their stated goals, you can praise them in a follow-up email to the group. And if you really want to be a rock star, you can actually send them a bottle of champagne to celebrate. But the one thing I didn't share, and this is often the question I get most, is who pays? The short answer is that I always do, but that doesn't mean that you have to. Deciding this far in advance is very important. It can be pretty awkward at the restaurant when the server comes to the table and asks, do you want separate checks, when you haven't discussed anything with your dinner guests in advance. So you have a few options. So first is that as a host, you pay. And again, almost all the dinners I've done to date have always been covered by me. Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. But for me, inviting people to a dinner, I'm always the one who pays. And according to Robert Cialdini, who's a best-selling author, it builds reciprocity, which is nice, but that's not the reason why I do it. I really do it for no other reason than that's always the way I've done it. Another option to cut the cost is to co-host the dinner with someone else who values relationships as much as you do. So for example, My friend Michael Fishman and Ramit Sethi hosted an awesome monthly dinner series in New York together for 2 years. The second option is guest paid. Now, most people are totally fine with picking up their own tab and want to. And if this is the route you would like to go, you can either make mention of it in the original invite email by referring to the dinner as a Dutch treat, or you can just set up a quick Eventbrite page and take payment in advance. Also, if you're doing these dinners for monetary purposes, then this is also a route you can do is use Eventbrite. Again, I usually pick up the tab, but a nice byproduct should you decide to go this route is that it guarantees that people attending are invested in the dinner, and that makes them much less likely to cancel last minute. The third option is to get a sponsor to pay, and finding a company who's willing to sponsor your dinners is a great option. A good friend of mine, Dan Jacob, he puts together these quarterly dinners and charges sponsors $20,000 a dinner. He's somebody I'm going to feature, actually, the updated version of Mastermind Dinners. But if that's part of your skill set, being able to deal with larger companies and sales, ultimately, it's a great avenue. But for me, I have MMT, right? One could say that my company sponsors our dinners, and it's a great investment from a business ROI perspective. I mean, for roughly $10,000, I can host 20 to 25 dinners, connecting and reinforcing existing ties with 125 to 150 people total. And in my last business, I wouldn't think twice about spending $10,000 on some kind of marketing with no guaranteed return. With these dinners, however, the value is just nothing short of mind-boggling. If it's a smaller size dinner and you want to make a game out of it, credit card roulette is something I do from time to time with groups that I know rather well, and it's a blast. Everyone at the table basically takes out their credit card and they hand it to the waiter. The waiter will then take those cards and either put it in a napkin or a glass or behind their back, and the waiter will start pulling out cards one by one. And the last card removed is stuck taking care of the bill. Again, it is a ton of fun to play and definitely makes the dinner really memorable. The key, though, is telling your guests in advance and allowing people who want to pay for their own bill to opt out. Another fun game is phone stacking. Now, when at a dinner, everyone is often on their phone, so grab them and you stack them face down in the center of the table. The first person to pick up their phone pays the bill for everybody there. That is pretty much a step-by-step of how to host a mastermind dinner of your own. And although I used dinners as an example in this episode, the framework can be used to host a lunch, a breakfast, a wine tour, and sometimes there's greater value in hosting a unique experience like a cooking class or even an axe throwing event instead of a dinner, because it puts everybody on a level playing field and naturally pushes people outside their comfort zone, and it also encourages them to be vulnerable. So be creative. I have friends like Saul Orwell, who you'll hear about in the next episode, who hosts food competitions as a way to bring people together, or Dan Martell, who you'll also hear in that episode, who will bring together people around a once-in-a-lifetime ski trip, or Philip McKernan, who will host golf trips in Ireland. The opportunity to benefit from being a catalyst and connecting people are endless, so schedule something in your calendar today. As mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I highlighted some of the concepts from my book, Mastermind Dinners, Building Lifelong Relationships by Connecting Experts, Influencers, and Linchpins. This book has sold surprisingly well and has an average rating of 4.7 stars out of 5 on Amazon over the last 214 reviews. If you're a member of the Community Made group, you can get access to a free PDF version in the resource section. If you're not a member, lucky for you, it's free to join. Simply visit communitymade.com to get access. I also promised a few other resources in this episode, including our intake form process, or a sample of our intake form, and one or two other things. We'll be sure to include that in the resource section. And as a second quick side note, I decided to take some of the concepts shared in this season of how to grow, nurture, and amplify your business relationships and deep dive in a live workshop setting. And I announced the first workshop. It surprisingly sold out in the first day and a half, 2 days, with people flying in from Spain and Australia and New York and all over the place. So we decided to announce a second date. So for dates and availability on the workshop, visit superconnectorworkshop.com. That's superconnectorworkshop.com. If you enjoy this episode, nothing would make me happier than hearing your thoughts and biggest takeaways. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Jason Gaynard. That's JaysonGaynard. or email me at jason@communitymade.com. Before I go, I got to give a shout out to Mark Fujiwara for leaving the following review on Facebook. He said, love Jason and his podcast. He is so authentic and open about who he is and really has a genuine desire to help other people. You can tell in his voice and the high caliber, well thought out people he brings on his podcast. Love the first episode where he reveals a lot about himself. My other favorite is Gary V. Thank you for the rating and review, Mark, my man. I really appreciate it. For the rest of you out there, if you enjoy this episode of the podcast or like what we're doing here at Community Made, I would be forever grateful if you would share this podcast with your friends or leave us an honest review on iTunes or on Facebook, just like Mark did. Join me for the next episode of Community Made, where I share an intimate conversation with two very good friends of mine, Dan Martell and Saul Orwell. Both of these guys have taken many of the concepts in this episode and have put them into action. Dan with his founders dinners and Saul with his cookie off.
Literally, I do it selfishly because I'm fascinated. I'm like, at the end of the day, I get a high off of seeing people tell me about the things that they love to do and create. And that's just me. And maybe that's not for everybody, but like, I just have an addiction to being around people that are passionate about what they're creating in the world.
I'll see you on the next episode, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your week.